In the jungles of Vietnam, 1968, a bizarre contraption rolled into the city of Hue. 6 massive, recoilless rifles jutted from its turret like the spines of some mechanical porcupine. The North Vietnamese tankers had never seen anything like it. Within minutes, their Soviet-built PT-76 amphibious tanks were burning wrecks. The weapon that destroyed them was the M50 Ontos, and it looked absolutely ridiculous. Ridiculous, perhaps, but deadly. This was a tank destroyer that military planners had already declared obsolete. A weapon designed for one war, rejected, then thrust into an entirely different conflict where it would prove devastatingly effective. The Ontos destroyed more enemy armor in Vietnam than any other American vehicle. Yet today, almost nobody remembers it existed. The story of the Ontos begins in the frozen hills of Korea, where American forces learned a brutal lesson. Communist tanks were overrunning United Nations positions, and the infantry had no effective way to stop them. Standard anti-tank weapons were too heavy, too slow to deploy. Soldiers were dying because they couldn't move firepower fast enough to meet armored threats. The US Marine Corps demanded a solution. They needed something light enough to be airdropped, fast enough to keep pace with infantry, and powerful enough to kill any tank on Earth. The specifications seemed impossible, but in the early 1950s, defense contractors believed anything was possible. The solution came from an unlikely source: recoilless rifles. These weapons had been around since World War II, but they'd never been the primary armament of an armored vehicle. The principle was elegant. When a conventional gun fires, the recoil pushes backward with tremendous force. A recoilless rifle vents propellant gases backward through an open breech, cancelling out the recoil. The result is a weapon that can fire massive projectiles from a lightweight platform. One recoilless rifle is useful. 6 recoilless rifles, the designers reasoned, would be devastating. The Alice Chalmers Manufacturing Company took on the challenge. Their creation was unlike any military vehicle before it. Imagine a tracked chassis barely longer than a small car, squatting low to the ground. Now mount 6 106mm recoilless rifles on it, 3 on each side of a small rotating turret. The result looked less like a tank destroyer and more like a mobile artillery battery designed by someone who'd lost their mind. The Marines called it the Ontos. The word is Greek, meaning the thing. It was an appropriate name for something that defied easy categorization. The vehicle weighed just 8.5 tons, making it one of the lightest armored vehicles in American service. A 200 horsepower Chrysler gasoline engine could push it to 30 miles per hour on roads. And more importantly, it could climb slopes that would stop heavier vehicles dead. The armor was minimal, just enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel. But then, the Ontos wasn't designed to brawl with enemy tanks. It was designed to hide, ambush, and disappear. Those 6 rifles were its reason for existence. Each could fire a high explosive anti-tank round capable of penetrating 400 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. The theoretical firepower was staggering. In a single salvo, an Ontos could unleash 6 projectiles, enough to obliterate an entire tank platoon in seconds. But here's where reality complicated the theory. Each rifle held only 1 round. After firing, the crew had to reload. And those 106mm shells were stored inside the vehicle, accessible only through small hatches. To reload, crew members had to expose themselves, climbing partially outside while under fire. In the heat of combat, reloading 6 rifles could take several agonizing minutes. The Ontos could deliver a devastating first strike. Then it became a very small, very vulnerable metal box. The crew compartment was claustrophobic, even by military vehicle standards. 3 men crammed into a space barely large enough for 2. The driver sat into center, hunched over controls. The gunner and vehicle commander squeezed in beside him, surrounded by ammunition, fire control systems, and the mechanical linkages of 6 large rifles. Visibility was poor. Ergonomics were an afterthought. Spending hours inside an Ontos in summer heat or winter cold was an exercise in misery. Production began in 1955. The Marines initially ordered 297 vehicles. Here was a weapon system born from urgent need, rushed from concept to production in just a few years. But even as the first Ontos rolled off the assembly line, the world was changing. Guided missiles were emerging as the future of anti-tank warfare. Why struggle with recoilless rifles when a wire-guided missile could be fired from a safer position with better accuracy? The Army, which had initially expressed interest, took one look at the Ontos and politely declined. They were developing their own systems, sleeker and more modern. The Marines, however, were committed. They'd invested in the concept, and Marine Corps doctrine valued aggressive, mobile firepower above technological sophistication. If the Ontos could be airdropped onto a beachhead and start killing tanks within minutes, its awkward design could be forgiven. But by the early 1960s, there was a problem. The Ontos had been designed to fight Soviet heavy tanks in Europe or Chinese armor in Asia. Those threats were real, but they existed in a potential future war. The war that was actually happening in the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia seemed to have no use for tank destroyers. American involvement in Vietnam was escalating, but this was a war of insurgency and counterinsurgency, of ambushes along jungle trails and firefights in villages. Nobody expected to face enemy tanks in Vietnam. The Ontos seemed destined for the scrap heap, a weapon without a mission, a solution to a problem that would never materialize. Some military planners suggested mothballing the entire fleet. Then came the Tet Offensive. January 1968. The North Vietnamese army launched a coordinated assault across South Vietnam. Cities that had seemed secure erupted in combat. And in those cities, the communists deployed something American forces hadn't encountered in significant numbers: armor. The Battle for Hue became the crucible where the Ontos found its purpose. North Vietnamese PT-76 amphibious tanks and Type 63 armored personnel carriers moved through the ancient capital's streets. They were light vehicles by Soviet standards, but in urban combat, they were terrifying. Infantry with rifles couldn't stop them. The Americans needed armor killers, and they needed them immediately. The Marines sent in the Ontos. What happened next surprised everyone, including the men who crewed them. The bizarre little vehicle, designed for open terrain ambushes, proved devastatingly effective in urban warfare. Those 6 rifles, mounted high on the rotating turret, could elevate and depress at angles that conventional tank guns couldn't match. An Ontos could hide behind a building, expose just its turret, and fire directly into upper-story windows or down narrow alleyways. The North Vietnamese had never encountered anything like it. Their intelligence briefings mentioned American tanks, armored personnel carriers, standard weapons systems. Nobody had told them about the thing with 6 rifles. During the Battle for Hue, Ontos crews engaged enemy armor at point-blank range. One vehicle destroyed 2 PT-76 tanks in rapid succession, the high-explosive anti-tank rounds punching through the light armor like paper. Another Ontos crew fired all 6 rifles into a fortified building, the simultaneous impact collapsing an entire wall and killing the machine gun team inside. But the Ontos found its true calling in direct fire support. Those 6 rifles weren't just tank killers. Loaded with high explosive rounds, they became devastating bunker busters. A single salvo could obliterate enemy positions that would require hours of artillery bombardment to suppress. Marine infantry learned to love the ugly little vehicle. When an Ontos appeared, enemy strongpoints disappeared. The reload problem, so concerning in training exercises, became manageable in actual combat. Crews developed techniques to reload faster. Infantry would provide covering fire while Ontos crew members worked exposed on the vehicle's flanks. It was dangerous. But in the chaos of urban combat, everything was dangerous. The Ontos earned its keep by delivering firepower that nothing else in the Marine infantry could match. One Ontos, during the fight for the Citadel at Hue, fired over 100 rounds in a single day. The barrels grew so hot that crew members poured water over them between engagements. The vehicle kept fighting. By the end of the Tet Offensive, the Ontos had a combat record that silenced its critics. It had destroyed more enemy armor in Vietnam than any other American vehicle. Not tanks, not attack helicopters. The obsolete, ridiculous-looking Ontos. Compare it to its contemporaries, and the achievement becomes more remarkable. The Army's M48 Patton tank was far more powerful, with thicker armor and a 90mm gun. But Pattons were heavy, difficult to transport, and their low-slung guns struggled in urban terrain. The M113 armored personnel carrier was ubiquitous in Vietnam, but its single 50 caliber machine gun couldn't touch enemy armor. Infantry anti-tank weapons, like the M72 Law rocket, were effective, but required soldiers to expose themselves at close range. The Ontos occupied a unique niche. It was light enough to be transported by helicopter sling load or landed directly from amphibious ships. It was mobile enough to negotiate terrain that would bog down heavier vehicles, and it carried enough firepower to engage anything from tanks to fortified bunkers. No other vehicle in Vietnam could claim all 3 advantages. Yet the Ontos had no real rival because no one else had built anything like it. The French had experimented with multiple recoilless rifles on light chassis, but never deployed the concept operationally. The Soviets had developed the ASU-57 airborne assault gun, but it mounted a single conventional cannon. The American Army's M56 Scorpion self-propelled anti-tank gun carried one 90mm rifle. One rifle. The Ontos carried 6. It was, in the truest sense, unique. And uniqueness in military procurement is often a death sentence. By 1969, the Marines were already planning to retire the Ontos. The vehicle had proven itself in combat, but wars end and peacetime logic returns. The Ontos was expensive to maintain. Spare parts were scarce because so few had been built. The recoilless rifles themselves were being phased out in favor of missiles like the Tau and Dragon. Most damning of all, the Ontos couldn't be upgraded. Its design was too specialized. too strange. There was no Ontos Mark II, no improved variant, just the original 1950s design, increasingly obsolete with each passing year. The last Ontos left Vietnam in 1970. By 1971, the entire fleet had been withdrawn from Marine Corps service. Some were sold to foreign militaries, others were scrapped. A handful ended up in museums, strange artifacts of a strange time. The vehicle that had destroyed more enemy armor than any other in Vietnam disappeared almost without notice. Today, the Ontos exists only in grainy photographs and the fading memories of the men who crewed them. A weapon too weird to remember, too effective to forget entirely, too unique to ever replace. The thing that saved lives in Hue vanished into history, another forgotten relic of forgotten battles. If you want to discover more war machines that changed history, then disappeared, subscribe. There are dozens of them, and their stories deserve to be told.